now that we have our topography model made, we want to put our building into this and actually make it fit well into the site. So typically your sites wouldn't be this aggressive. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on something like a column. So in my top view, this won't really be to scale at all, but I'm going to just draw a couple columns. So I'm going to copy this out and I'm going to do hold Alt and click that. Whoops. So if we hold Alt and then click this, it will actually make a copy. And then what we can do is we'll put a bounding box around this. And then if we offset that, we'll say that that's going to be our building. So what we're going to do is we're going to move these up to a point, or move them down in this case, I guess, to a point where they're totally underneath our surface. So typically they would be somewhere within your surface. Actually, they wouldn't be totally below, and you would figure out obviously how deep the columns need to go into the ground and things like that. Basically what we're talking about here is if they're poking out or if they're above, so something like this won't sit nicely on the site. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that all of our geometry is totally under. You can see that that one's still showing a little bit, so we'll just move it further down. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an extrude. Here you want to make sure that these are actually solid, so we'll click solid equals yes, and then we'll just bring them up to a level around there. Obviously with your building you would be much more precise about this. I'm going to move this up to these columns, and then we'll just do an extrude on this, and we'll act like this is a building that's sitting in the middle of my site. So the first thing I'm going to do, which isn't totally necessary, but I want to make sure that all of the solids, everything is solid in here. So it doesn't really matter if these are 4 individual solids or if this whole thing, we do a Boolean union and turn into one whole solid. I'll treat it as individual solids since that's probably a more realistic scenario for how you would go about doing this. So here we're going to be using a command called Boolean difference. Basically what Boolean difference is it's going to take any intersection between this column and this site. It's going to hollow it out in the site, but it's going to leave this column alone as it is. So I'm going to do one column at a time. If you want more information on the Boolean operations, there is a Boolean tutorial. I'll put that right below this tutorial so that you can find it really easily. So Boolean difference. So select surfaces or polysurfaces to subtract from. So that's going to be this. And keep in mind, this needs to be a totally solid surface. So if it doesn't have a bottom on it, this operation isn't going to work. It needs to be totally what we call watertight, aka if you went to try to pour water into the inside of this, there would be no way for it to get into it. Or if we submerge this in a bathtub, there would be no way for water to get inside of it. So once you've selected surfaces to subtract from, we're going to hit enter or space. Then select surfaces or polysurfaces to just subtract with, and we're going to go ahead and click one of these. Delete input, we're going to click yes, and then space. So you see if we click yes there, it's actually going to delete my column. So if I go back and do that again, Boolean difference, subtract from this one with this one, but here I'm going to do delete input equals no. So you can see I added that black curve there. So what does that black curve mean? If I grab this and I do a hide, that means that I actually made a hole down into this. So you can see I now have a hole that's going down into my site the length of that column. So if I show that and then I do this, so I do a Boolean difference. So you can do more than one of these surfaces at once. I wouldn't get too crazy if you have a bunch of them. And then you can see if we hide these, what we now have is a series of holes in my site where those columns are actually going into the site. And this is a good habit to get into because you don't really want to have too many intersecting objects within your model. So this is good because that actually will slide down into that. So when you go to actually make a model of this thing physically, you'll have this already modeled into the site so that you can do certain operations and you can output this to a fabrication model that could actually receive the columns, and you're not having to cut these crazy angles to actually get your model to sit onto the site. So it gets a little bit more complex than this. There's the Boolean tutorials to check out. But the good thing here is that you basically usually have topography that's not this steep. So you may even just treat this as your building and go down into it and do a Boolean difference. The main thing to remember here is that in order to execute the Boolean difference properly, everything in your model needs to be entirely solid. So whether the whole model is solid doesn't matter, but anything that touches the actual terrain of your model will need to be solid in order to execute this command properly.